Hello, everybody. Welcome to Bible study today. It's great to be with all of you. We're going to be taking a look at Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14, which is another one of Matthew's parables um, by Jesus in a list of other parables where Jesus is talking to the chief priests and the elders. And today's parable is especially a difficult one. It oftentimes gets misinterpreted or used in a way that I think represents God in a poor way, or in a way that isn't consistent with how we understand God. And so I want us to dig into this text today and really just take a look at what it means and how we can better understand it. So this is Matthew 22, verses 1 to 14. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burnt their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to them, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him to the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" So, as we take a look at this text, there's a lot of things I think that we need to do in order to understand the context as to which we're reading this text. The first thing, I want to encourage all of you to take a look at chapter 21 of Matthew, and then read on in through chapter 22. I think once you do that, it'll really kind of help to put the parable into context with the rest of the scripture passages that are going on throughout this whole story. And basically, what's happening throughout this whole story is it starts first in chapter 21, where Jesus turns over the tables in the synagogues, and then there's a list of parables that Jesus is engaged in, where he's engaged in this conversation between the chief priests and the elders. And specifically, he's in the previous chapter, he's talking about a landowner and his tenants, a landowner and the vineyard, and in that context, in those parables, we see God as the landowner. And then when you get to chapter 22, Jesus continuing his conversation with the chief priests and the elders, but he shifts gears, and it seems at first that what Jesus is doing is he's comparing God to a king. Um, but what I would encourage you to do is read through the text again in chapter 22 and substitute the word God for the word king. And when you do that, ask yourself whether or not that fits. When you substitute the word God for king, whether or not the attributes that emerge from this text for God are consistent with the attributes that you know and understand about God or believe about God. Take some time and do that. And I think ultimately, when you do, you'll find that it just doesn't fit. And I think ultimately what Jesus has done here is he's shifted gears with the chief priests and the elders, because in the previous text, we know that despite the parables, despite all of what Jesus is doing to try to change their perspective, to change their thinking, the chief priests and elders just aren't getting it. And as a matter of fact, they're getting more and more angry with Jesus. And I think what Jesus is doing here is he's shifting gears, and he's poking fun or recognizing the hypocrisy of what it means to put your faith in a ruler like a king. Um, and so he's doing that to the chief priests and the elders, and challenging them to look at this in a completely different way, and again pushing them back to this idea of comparing Jesus, or comparing God to the landowner, not to a king. So along with that, what I'd like to do is just have two questions for you, and I encourage you to go ahead and comment on Facebook, on YouTube, or send me a private message or an email with your answers to the questions. The first is, if we were to compare God to a king, um, what attributes would emerge when we made that comparison? The second one is, if we were to look at God as a landowner, as the previous parables, then what attributes would we give to God or assign to God? Take some time and answer those questions, and then we'll come back and we'll revisit this text, and I think it'll help us look at the text from a different perspective. Thanks so much for joining me today for Bible study. I'll see you next time.